The name of the show is Comments with Dr. James Haney. The issue is the Emancipation Proclamation, and this is our second segment. And of course, the first segment, Dr. Mitchell talked about the institution of slavery. And during the second segment, we are now joined by Mr. Baxter, Professor Baxter from Tennessee State University, a professor of history at Tennessee State University. And let me welcome you to Comments with Dr. James Haney.
My pleasure.
Mr. Baxter. Dr. Mitchell, we're still dealing with the Emancipation Proclamation, and what we're trying to do is to at least give some idea of the impact that this document had upon race relations in America. And you gave us an overview of the institution of slavery. So by September of 1862, there are some 4.5 million slaves in the United States of America. Abraham Lincoln is about to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, what will be the reactions? First of all, what about this document, Dr. Mitchell?
All right. Now, this document was not arrived at by Lincoln brashly. He took some time and some thought. Lincoln's primary objective was to save the Union. By that point in time, however, on the battlefield, the Union had suffered several serious defeats. Lincoln believed that freeing slaves, or the use of slaves, which could only follow their freedom, would be an excellent war strategy. So after the Battle of Gettysburg, it wasn't a resounding victory, but it was enough of a victory. He announced his proclamation, freeing slaves in those states in arms against the Union.
Very good. Now, Professor Baxter, what impact did the Emancipation Proclamation have on first the North and then on the South?
The impact, first of all, that emancipation had on the North was that it was able to bring forth additional manpower. And that manpower consisted of the slaves in those territories in which had been conquered by the various Union forces. However, we find prior to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, those generals serving in the Union forces saw a great need to emancipate those slaves existing in the territories in which they had conquered.
In other words, you're saying that generals in the Union Army were willing to use slaves before the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation?
Certainly. However, we find that President Lincoln was totally outraged by those generals taking that authority within their realm to emancipate slaves prior to his officially issuing the Emancipation Proclamation.
In other words, they forced, you said that they forced his hand in terms of the Emancipation.
Certainly did.
What about that, Dr. Mitchell?
Yes, certainly. Not just the unions, but also politically his hand was being forced.
Very good.
By an act of Congress in the city of Washington, D.C., or the District of Columbia, slaves had been freed. Slaves had been freed in several areas in the territories. There could be no slavery. So Lincoln just about reached a point, if he didn't make some presidential proclamation, the Congress may have freed slaves through congressional action.
You mentioned the Confiscation Act. Now, exactly what was that?
Okay, now, prior to Lincoln's issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, I think that's an important fact we need to make in terms of the political aspects as related to President Lincoln. If we look at Lincoln's political career as early as the year 1849, while serving in the United States Congress, Lincoln introduced a bill to Congress that would make for emancipation of slaves in the District of Columbia. But not only that, if we look at months prior to Lincoln's issuing of Emancipation Proclamation, the United States Congress issued 2 confiscation acts. The first act, he asked that those properties being used by the Confederacy to support their rebellion would be confiscated by the Union forces once conquered that particular area.
Slaves would be included in this?
Not slaves, just properties being used to support the Confederacy efforts in terms of their military force. The second Confiscation Act went on to state that slaves would be confiscated, okay? Now, Lincoln would issue, September 22nd, 1862, his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In that, he gave those states who were in rebellion 100 days to release their slaves, come to their proper places within the Union. And upon having done that, he promised them that he would introduce an amendment to Congress, which would become a part of the United States Constitution that would allow the federal government to compensate those southern slaveholders or the southern planters who had freely released their slaves. But not only that, ultimately, Abraham Lincoln wanted to relocate those slaves once they had been freed. He wanted to relocate them to an area such as Haiti, Panama, or somewhere in South America. And certainly that he had a profound reason for doing so, based on the impact slave labor had played in the Solid South.
Dr. Mitchell, now how does that fit in with the idea that President Lincoln had that the Union had to be preserved either half slave or half free?
All right, Lincoln said the Union must be preserved. And what he's trying to do is get around what was often even called in the Negro problem, what to do with the Negro.
Very good point.
So that the Union would be preserved, and that was always utmost in his mind. Lincoln was also a politician, and that's the point. And like any politician, he wanted to do something that would also bring his party together. And the North certainly didn't intend to be divided politically over this question of emancipated slaves. I think another key point is that even with the Confiscation Acts, once those slaves were freed, they were expected to stay in the South. There had never been any uniform or universal call to bring freed slaves north.
What about that, Mr. Baxter, the North's reaction to the Emancipation Proclamation? Because certainly it impacted upon the 4.5 million slaves in the South, but in that area where there were no slaves, in the northern parts of the United States, how did the North react to this document?
Well, first of all, you have to look at the sectional differences going into the Civil War period. The northern sector of these United States of America was an industrial area. Holding slaves in the North certainly proved not to be profitable. If we look at the West, then we have an emerging agricultural section of the country in competition with the Solid South. The northern sector of this country shared no sympathy with the South as related to its slaves. The northern sector of the country also did not want any parts of the Negro in that particular region because there certainly was not a need.
You make an excellent point there, though. The North has gone to free labor.
Certainly.
It's an industrialized economy with free labor, and that North doesn't want to compete with a slave labor South.
Right.
The South's only hope had been that England might join in support, but England has emancipated its slaves in the 1820s because it's gone to a free market economy.
Very good.
And so Abraham Lincoln now decides to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, supported for the most part by large numbers of folks outside of the executive branch, congressional leaders, many people in the various states in the North, and at the same time not really looked upon with any kind of favor by people in the northern parts of the United States.
The point you made about the congressional is most important. The stalwart Republicans wanted to punish the South. And what better way to punish than to strip them of millions of dollars in value? And those slaves represented the millions of dollars.
Okay, let us break here, and we'll be back in this final segment to talk about some of the other impacts that the proclamation had upon the institution of slavery. We'll be back with you following this commercial break.